Hi, ActiveHistory.ca is pleased to present a recording of the roundtable discussion, Sochi and Beyond, Russia's anti-gay legislation, human rights, and the practice of history. The roundtable was held on Sunday, May 25th, 2014, as part of the Canadian Historical Association annual meeting at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca.
Given the focus of our discussion today, I thought I'd explore two key issues. First, I'll talk about the extent to which international sporting events are highly sexualized arenas, something that institutions such as the International Olympic Committee or the Commonwealth Games Federation have never been terribly comfortable acknowledging or addressing. Second, I'll highlight some continuities between the political campaigns that emerged in reaction to the Sochi Olympics and calls to boycott or move earlier sports mega events to alternative locations. I'm going to work my way through some fairly depressing examples, but I'm going to promise now to end on a reasonably optimistic note. Before the Sochi Games, I think the International Olympic Committee's most awkward engagement with questions of sexuality concerned mandatory gender verification tests, which were all the rage from an official standpoint during the 1960s. This was an era when a breakthrough in sex testing technology facilitated intrusive examinations to prove that a level playing field was maintained. In other words, that men were not entering races reserved for women. As historian Stefan Wiedeker notes, the tests did not find what the officials were looking for. That is, rather than finding cheaters, men pretending to be women, the IOC discovered, to its surprise, intersexual people. If you think the IOC is behind the times today when it comes to issues of human rights and sexuality, just imagine how ill-prepared it was in the 1960s to wrap its collective head around the notion that gender and sexual identity exist along a continuum. Undeterred, the IOC continued mandatory testing into the 1990s, at which point it opted to impose such examinations selectively, whenever an individual athlete's sexual identity was deemed to be suspicious. The timing here is not coincidental. The IOC eased up on these regulations just as the Cold War was coming to an end. For as Wiedeker and others have noted, gender verification tests, and thus sexual identity, at the Olympics were an ongoing element of the psychological battle during the Cold War, with so-called mannish communist female athletes serving as a source of alarm and paranoia amongst Western officials. Despite ongoing rhetoric championing the ideal of keeping sport and politics separate, something we continue to hear today, here was a case in which geopolitics directly shaped how competitions were carried out. Moreover, the IOC recognized that these invasive procedures offered collateral benefits. In 1972, IOC President Avery Brundage proudly announced that gender verification tests had served an aesthetic aim. Women competitors, he declared, quote, were more feminine now. When I came across this quote, I was reminded of FIFA President Sepp Blatter's 2004 suggestion that female soccer players compete in tighter shorts. Both statements suggest that when it's convenient, international sporting bodies are happy to seek out ways to directly promote selective ideals of gender and sexual identity, despite frequent claims that such organizations focus solely on sport. From a policy history perspective, then, there's little in the IOC's past that would lead us to think that it would have a tradition of progressive thinking to draw upon as it faced demands to respond productively to Russia's anti-gay legislation. But I also think there's an interesting social history angle to this as well. And we can look at this by recognizing that gatherings such as the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games can be highly charged sexual spaces. Not so much on the track or in the swimming pool, of course, but in the athlete's village. As James Buckley notes, fit bodies, sequestered in close quarters, coupled with a schedule that features high levels of stress, followed by release, provide no shortage of opportunities for sexual activity. As American swimmer Nelson Diebel so eloquently put it, quote, if you like six-packs, see the gymnasts. Like butts, go to track and field. The only thing you're deprived of is fat. If you're the rare athlete who likes sedentary bodies, you're out of it. Team officials and event organizers have long been aware of this situation. From what I've been able to tell when it came to the Commonwealth Games, team officials would intervene with strict warnings to their athletes to stay focused on their competitive responsibilities, while the organizers responded with so-called chastity fences that separated the men's and women's dormitories. By the end of the 20th century, health officials were intervening by ensuring that the requisite number of condoms were available. Apparently, this was no small task. I'm not generally recognized for my strength in quantitative research, but I can confidently report that at the 1994 Commonwealth Games, 2,500 athletes secured some 14,000 condoms. At the Delhi Games in 2010, which boasted 7,000 competitors, so many used condoms were flushed down the Games village toilets that officials declared a plumbing emergency. In short, sexual activity and international sporting events enjoy something of a symbiotic relationship. And this is something that all host nations and cities establish plans to deal with well in advance. I hope at some point that an astute observer will come along and explore the connection between such local event planning and broader state concerns about sexual activity and propaganda in Russia as they played out in 2014. I would hazard a guess, though, that in their investigation they will come across not only instances of amorous exchanges between athletes, but also fairly routine instances of homophobia, not simply among politicians and officials, but among athletes as well. In researching the history of the Commonwealth Games, I've come across a few disturbing examples that serve to remind us that athletes, too, can be conduits for conservative gender ideals. For example, I came across the story of Bruce Walsh, a strapping policeman from Sydney, Australia, who served as the weightlifting coach for Western Samoa at the 1974 Commonwealth Games in Christchurch, New Zealand. Under the delightful headline, "He Won't Expose His Form," the Sydney Morning Herald reported that Walsh passed up an opportunity to march in the opening ceremonies when he learned that he would be expected to wear, quote, a native dress featuring a lava skirt. Quote, "There's no show of me getting into a skirt," he explained. "Imagine the ribbing I'd get back home." 16 years later, at the Auckland Games in 1990, the Australian team was rocked repeatedly by press reports of dissension and misbehavior in the athletes' village. None was more unseemly, the press noted, than an episode in which 1,500-meter runner Michelle Baumgartner was publicly subjected to verbal abuse by an unnamed male teammate who urged her to show off her penis. Media reports noted both the tendency for the athletes to close ranks and protect the identity of the perpetrator, as well as the Australian officials' desire to refrain from pursuing firm disciplinary action. In short, a wide gap between professed ideals of inclusivity and the reality of modern big-budget sporting events is not just something that plagues high-ranking officials, but also athletes themselves. The other key point that deserves some context, I think, is the nature of political protests at and about the Olympics. In the lead-up to the Sochi Olympics, some called on the IOC to move the Games to a country with a more progressive human rights record, like Canada. The lead-up to the Games also featured a flurry of calls and petitions for nations such as Canada to boycott the Games. Neither scenario was pursued, but in both cases, the demands for action and the lack of action that followed have historical precedents worth considering. Opponents of China's human rights record actively protested the decision to award the 2008 Olympics to Beijing. But the IOC decided that the show must go on. In 1968, 10 days before the Summer Olympics in Mexico City, Mexican authorities massacred an untold number of student protesters. But the IOC decided that the show must go on. 4 years later in Munich, with 11 Israeli athletes killed by Arab terrorists, IOC President Avery Brundage was adamant that, quote, the Games must go on. There's a fairly consistent pattern here. A combination of factors, including an unwillingness to nullify years of work and the billions of dollars it takes to prepare to host the Games, a desire to justify claims that sport and politics should not mix, and a belief that a greater good is served by ensuring that such international gatherings are not canceled, whatever the cost, ensures that the Games, once allocated to a host nation, stay allocated to that nation. The IOC is not alone here. Attempts by Australian Aboriginal rights protesters to force Brisbane, Australia to give up its right to host the 1982 Commonwealth Games proved unsuccessful as well. With games unlikely to be moved or cancelled then, activists have turned to other methods of protest. Most obviously, these have taken the form of boycotts. In 1980, an American-led boycott of the Moscow Olympics protested the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 4 years later, the USSR responded by boycotting the Olympics in Los Angeles. Closer to home, African-led boycotts of the 1976 Montreal Olympics and the 1978 Commonwealth Games in Edmonton attempted to hammer home objections to South Africa's apartheid policy. As Barbara Key's recent work on the 1936 Berlin Olympics shows us, one of the key tensions at play in such cases pits pro-boycott voices, arguing that the most effective political strategy is to isolate the offending nations, while anti-boycott voices maintain that constructive engagement is the only way forward, and that it would be unfair to ask athletes to make sacrifices to address situations that diplomats and international sports officials had failed to alleviate. Mark Tewksbury, Canada's openly gay former Olympic gold medalist, argued the latter position quite persuasively during the Sochi Games. Given this context, what forms of protest remain? I'll conclude with two intriguing examples. The first highlights the extent to which Olympic protest has become commodified. In the lead-up to the Sochi Games, American Apparel offered progressive consumers the opportunity to voice their displeasure with the Russian authorities and the IOC by purchasing clothing that featured Principle 6 of the Olympic Charter, which ostensibly prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. I was wearing my t-shirt on the day that Lyle emailed me, inviting me to participate in the panel. Not everyone was impressed with this form of protest. One commentator emphasized that such actions pale in comparison to Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their fists on the podium in Mexico City to protest the plight of African Americans in the United States. I think that's a fair point. But if one leafs through John Carlos's recent autobiography, you can get a pretty firm sense of the penalties that are meted out to athletes who lock horns with Olympic officials by suggesting that sport is inherently political. In one of the more devastating asides in the book, Carlos reveals that with his athletic career effectively terminated, he was reduced to pitching Puma sweatsuits and hoodies at a stand at the Munich Olympics. Instructed to hand out the gear to anyone keen to sport the Puma brand, he did as he was told. And then he reeled in horror when he realized that the terrorists had visited his stand to secure clothing that would help them blend in with the Olympic athletes in order to kidnap and murder the Israelis. Let me try to conclude then on a positive note. In a development that's closer to home. As Canadians sought ways to express their opposition to the Russian legislation and their support for LGBT athletes in Sochi, rainbow flags were raised on public buildings across the country. Vancouver and Montreal were early adherents to this symbolic showing. That this was happening in larger urban centers did not really surprise me. But I was genuinely shocked and pleased to see pride flags raised in New Brunswick, at the provincial legislature, on university campuses, and at City Hall in Fredericton by a mayor who in the 1990s had refused to publicly declare a gay pride day. It's almost as if Russian opposition to gay rights and the muscle memory built up during the Cold War has provided officials and civic leaders with increased political space to publicly declare what not too long ago was well beyond the pale of political culture. And that, I think, is a positive, if unanticipated legacy of the Sochi Olympics. Thank you.
Chairperson, friends and colleagues, thanks for coming tonight. I want to thank my fellow panelists for participating. And this is the famous T-shirt that Michael referenced, the Principle 6 T-shirt. It is the non-discrimination clause in the Olympic Charter. I read reports of comments by a number of IOC officials in January, including Mr. Richard Pound, the Canadian IOC representative, which were downplaying the impact of Russia's so-called anti-gay propaganda law. And Mr. Pound was quoted as saying, well, at least they aren't executing anyone. So I was going to prepare a fairly detailed deconstruction and refutation of Dick Pound's remarks, but I really don't need to. I just need to invite him and the other members of the IOC to read Principle 6 of the Olympic Charter. And I think that does the trick. This panel is part of the rollout of the CHA executive's 15th of January letter to President Putin. We wanted to go on record as affirming the human rights of historians to study the past, free from coercion and intimidation, while also showing our support for our LGBT sisters and brothers who are under attack in Russia. Today I want to speak on the implications of the Russian anti-gay law for the practice of history and suggest that our own prior history of anti-gay repression here in Canada helps illuminate this issue. I do not have the benefit of first-hand experience of Russia like Erica and other specialists, but I hope that my experience of researching aspects of LGBT history in Canada will be relevant. As well, I will draw on the observations of practitioners of the humanities and social sciences who are close to the situation in Russia, including Alexander Kondakov, Mariana Muravieva, Laurie Essig, and Dan Healy, who kindly shared their advice. Despite many social, cultural, and political differences in the evolution of our respective countries, the currently precarious situation of queer people in Russia is not foreign to Canadian experience. The reports of systemic state-sanctioned prosecution and discrimination in Russia, accompanied by random, officially unsanctioned hate crimes, have close historical parallels in Canada and in the not very distant past. And in fact, hate crimes are still at very high levels for LGBT people relative to other targeted groups. Our experience in Canada teaches us that the greatest enemy of historically disadvantaged groups is silence. In its anti-gay legislation, the Russian government has focused its efforts on silencing sexual minorities and anyone else publishing or contemplating publishing research or commentary on LGBT history, society, and culture. Imagine for a minute what Canadian history would look like if we were forbidden to write about the experience of French Canadians, or Jewish Canadians, or Canadian women. What happens to a country's culture when an entire category of humanity is deemed off limits to historical discourse? And yet that is more or less what happened here in Canada, where pervasive silence over more than a century after Confederation inhibited the assertion and exercise of rights and freedoms by LGBT people, much as silence currently serves the forces of repression in Russia. In an article on same-sex experience in Western Canada's settlement era, which will shortly be coming out in the Journal of Canadian Studies, I examined the closet as a necessary survival mechanism between about 1870 and 1945. For persons animated by same-sex desire, the closet was a pragmatic tactic, enabling same-sex interactions in a hostile social environment. Daniel Schluter, Dan Healy, and Alexander Kondakov have similarly written on the pervasiveness of the closet in Soviet and post-Soviet era Russia, where it likewise facilitated social and interpersonal interactions in contexts of criminalization and marginalization. A problem for sexual minorities in both Canada and Russia was that, while the closet helped facilitate some interactions, the resort to covertness undermined the capacity for individual and community identity formation, necessary prerequisites to the assertion of a marginalized group's human rights. It seems probable that in Canada the closet delayed social and human rights advances for many years by keeping LGBT people invisible, out of sight and out of mind. It was only after lesbian and gay people came out publicly in sufficient numbers and demanded equality that change became possible. A very recent development dating from the We Demand March on Parliament Hill in 1971 and the gay liberation movement that succeeded it. The discipline of history can help advance the status of marginalized groups by shining light on past injustices while documenting their persistence through assorted challenges. Conversely, history can be a regressive force, reinforcing the marginal status of minorities by ignoring their collective past and contributing to a general veil of silence. For the practice of history, the road to silence has involved at least 4 junctures of decision-making and practice, as documented by the Haitian historian Michel Rolfe Trouillot. Quote, the moment of fact creation, the moment of fact assembly, the moment of fact retrieval, and the moment of retrospective significance, or the making of history. The role of fact creation and assemblage in enabling or conversely inhibiting historical discourse can be illustrated by a relatively recent example from Western Canada. In 1987, my partner Ron and I participated in the campaign to convince members of the Manitoba legislature to amend the province's Human Rights Act to include sexual orientation among its prohibited grounds of discrimination. In the debate in the legislature, then Leader of the Opposition and future Premier Gary Filmon endorsed a comment attributed to former Premier Ed Schreier, quote, "In my opinion, if allowed to become too visible in society, it, meaning homosexuality, cannot help but have a negative and detrimental effect on the younger generation," unquote. Filmon and Schreier were endorsing essentially the same position expressed by members of the Russian parliament in 2013 when debating the anti-gay propaganda law, echoed in recent statements by Vladimir Putin. The premise was the same. Same-sex sexuality allegedly threatens young people and therefore must be silenced. The charge was classic fear-mongering because there is no scientific evidence to support it. A year later, I accepted an invitation from the Provincial Archives of Manitoba to serve on its Oral History Grants Committee. Among the projects we deemed worthy was the application by a Winnipeg LGBT group for $10,000 to carry out historical interviews with lesbian and gay elders. Years later, I was privately briefed on the fallout from this small disbursement. After learning of the grant, the Minister of Culture, Heritage and Recreation took the provincial archivist to task and demanded that it be rescinded. To his credit, the archivist refused to comply with this demand and fortunately was not fired for his resistance. Still, this incident from only 25 years ago shows the lengths to which politicians were prepared to silence LGBT people by seeking to prevent the creation of materials documenting our history. A similar scenario unfolded in Alberta in 1997, when then Provincial Treasurer Stockwell Day learned of the grant to the Red Deer Museum for a Lesbian and Gay Oral History Project and demanded that it be rescinded. Again, the clear message was that proponents of LGBT history needed to be silenced. These attacks on lesbian and gay oral history were prompted by the perception that such archival materials and historical writing would make LGBT people more visible, an intolerable affront to the proponents of marginalization. My colleague Alexander Kondakov of St. Petersburg, Russia, has written of the role of the 1934 Stalinist criminalization of gay sex, mentioned by Erica. I think he gave 34, but anyway, 33 or 34, in forcing sexual minorities underground and rendering them invisible. For Western Canada, my own studies on male same-sex experience identified similar trends. Increasing state repression following the 1890 Gross Indecency Law enabled the silencing of same-sex sexuality, achieved in one case through the informal exiling of men convicted of same-sex activities in Regina, and in many other cases through jailings for victimless crimes, so-called crimes. The repression peaked in the 1940s and presaged the federal anti-gay, anti-lesbian national security campaign of the late 1950s and 1960s, as documented by Patricia Gentile and Gary Kinsman. Authoritarian state forces succeeded in thwarting active resistance through coercive interrogations and intimidation of gay men, as discussed in my article on Edmonton's same-sex trials of 1942 in Archivarium. Only by exposing such past injustices and publicly affirming the human rights of all citizens will we be able to begin to move through and beyond these dark corners of our history. Other stages in the imposition of silence are sometimes more subtle than political attacks and police bullying, but no less inhibiting in their potential effects on the writing of history. For historians, it's these last two phases of Trouillot's silencing process that are most salient. That is, the making of narratives and the writing of history. As professional historians, we recurrently make decisions whether or not to pursue research topics, consult particular collections, ask specific questions of our materials, or decide how to assemble these materials into narratives. Until very recently, a typical outcome of these determinations dealing with these issues was to avoid lesbian, gay, and transgender dimensions of research topics, ignore collections documenting queer history, pass over questions relating to sexual minorities, and omit inclusion of LGBT experience in our historical narratives. Canada has never had an anti-gay propaganda law, and so most of these constraints were self-imposed by historians, an illustration of the role of internalized homophobia and self-censorship in regulating historical discourse. Notwithstanding recent progress, we still have a long way to go to be truly inclusive regarding the experience of LGBT people among other historically disadvantaged minorities, not only in specialized topical treatments, but in survey textbooks in Canadian, regional, and national history. These equity issues confronting us in Canada nevertheless pale in comparison to the enormous challenges facing Russia's LGBT community. These include the continuing legacy of Stalinist anti-gay oppression, widespread fear and ignorance across Russia of gender and sexual and gender identity minorities, and the current pact between the Russian Orthodox Church and the country's authoritarian leader, Mr. Putin, to crack down on sexual difference. To state-sanctioned discrimination, we can add the scourge of hate crimes, so chillingly revealed in the documentary Hunted in Russia, recently broadcast in the CBC's The Passionate Eye. Unlike Canada, Russia apparently does not have a well-established tradition of officially sanctioned human rights codes to which oppressed groups might turn for support. LGBT people face a daunting challenge in Russia against the entrenched homophobia existing at virtually every level. Those of us who are fortunate enough to live in freer circumstances need to continue to stand with our brothers and sisters wherever our support might be of assistance. Beyond issues of basic human rights for LGBT Russians, for historians everywhere, any imposed legal, social, cultural, and political restrictions on scholarly inquiry are intolerable to the pursuit of knowledge. Knowing the destructive effects of prior silences in our own history, we have a moral obligation to support free expression and scholarly inquiry, and to show our solidarity with groups and peoples confronting systemic discrimination analogous to struggles in our own country's history. One of the most important parts of the Canadian Historical Association's mandates is to defend the human rights of historians, and the CHA has taken a principled position in opposing Russia's anti-gay propaganda law. It is important that we continue to encourage the unfettered study of the past everywhere, essential to the building and maintenance of democracy and freedom, whether in Russia, Canada, or elsewhere. Thank you.
Good evening. My role today is to replace the Canadian Association's letter to Russian President Vladimir Putin in the context of its long-standing defense of the rights of historians and its promotion of a history which is respectful of human rights. First, by speaking of the history of this kind of advocacy within the CHA, a task for which I have relied much on the contribution of Marielle Campo at the CHA office, and then more largely of Canada's place in the transnational movement of human rights. And here I have to thank Dominique Marshall, one of the main historians of human rights, who is with us tonight. By offering support in favor of the LGBT historians of Russia and in Russia, and to historians from elsewhere unable to write freely about Russia's past, CHA members have honored the tradition of international solidarity in front of persecution, and of reference to universal notions of a common humanity, which are at the very core of the history of human rights. I will argue that the anti-gay laws of Russia and the current campaigns against them show that while academic and sexual freedom based on human rights are becoming, and I cite the Palmer Dictionary of Transnational History, are becoming central normative issues within world politics enshrined in numerous treaties and conventions, they are still at the mercy of states which are at the same time leading defenders leading defenders of and leading threats to human rights. So first, human rights and the defense of historians and academic freedom. The protest on the occasion of Sochi comes from a history of defense of academic freedoms. The first core value of the CHA statement on research ethics is its commitment, and I cite, to free and open inquiry, adhering to the ideal of academic freedom. The professional defense of its members is at the center of a professional association. In the early years of the CHA from 1922, this took mainly the form of efforts for the recognition of professional standards for the delineation and the guarantee of the profession's competence. For the CHA, expressing the defense of academic freedom and professional autonomy in terms of human rights is a more recent phenomenon, which dates from the 1980s mainly. It seems to have partly come from a more explicit commitment to the defense of the interests of women and of graduate students within the profession, an instance amongst many when gender-based social movements contributed to the shaping of human rights discussion in Canada. And then I quote my colleague Miriam, stupid, I don't remember her last name, who is, anyway, I'll tell you later, who is one of the, who is the main, really, historian of all this. A direct commitment to advocating the rights of historians both in and outside of Canada was formalized by the CHA Council in 2006 when it unanimously adopted a policy, and I quote, for making representations to different levels of government or other institutions relating to the human rights of professional historians, including such issues as academic freedom, the right to practice history free from intimidation or harassment, and equality rights of all professional historians or students of history to engage in all aspects of their discipline without discrimination. Adopting this resolution in the face of mounting demands for advocacy, the CHA was not unique. The same timing seems to apply in the case of the American Historical Association. It is in the 1980s that the CHA seems to have extended its defense of human rights and opposition to threats to free and open historical inquiry abroad, protesting, for instance, against the imprisonment of dissident historian Bronislaw Jeremek by the Polish government in 1983. Another important influence on such position is the movement of internationalization of the defense of academic freedom and the concomitant advocacy for the spiritual rights of a universal intellectual class. I quote the treaty of the time, which originated, declaration of the time, which originated in the interwar year. Interestingly, it is in 1995, after the quinquennial meeting of the International Committee of Historical Sciences, met in Canada, Montreal, where a roundtable on power, liberty, and the work of historians took place, that a network for concerned historians was created to help campaigns for persecuted historians and censorship, and which has participated in 40 such campaigns so far, and collected codes of ethics. Significantly, the Canadian court judgments posted on this same site, as often in Canadian recent history of violation of international human rights, touched internal conflict between the Canadian government and Canada's First Nations. Second part of my presentation, the transnational history of sexuality-based rights and the role of Canada in this. To understand our current campaign, the question of the rights of LGBT has to be added to that of academic freedom. The increasing centrality of human rights within international politics since World War II only fully started to concern LGBT people towards the 1980s. Similar to international networks promoting academic freedoms are those devoted to the defense and promotion of LGBT rights, sexuality rights, NGOs such as the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, founded in 1990. In large part, the attention to sex acts as a concern for transnational politics over the last 2 decades of the 20th century came from the epidemic of HIV. Associated to this movement, the importance of the rhetoric of universal sexuality rights rose, as did the international attention to persecution based on sexuality in some countries. Other countries, Canada amongst them, opened their asylum policies to victims of sexuality-based discrimination. Studies such as transnational reconfigurations of gender and sexuality, studies of such reconfigurations of gender and sexuality underline the role of LGBT scholarship as a vector and a place for the beginning of transportation, a fact that brings us back to the importance of the very kind of historical work the CHA is trying to protect in the current campaign. There is no mention of sexual orientation in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and the question was only debated in the General Assembly of the UN for the first time in 2008. So these transnational NGOs were instrumental in the adoption by the UN Human Rights Council 3 years ago of a resolution addressing specifically and explicitly the issue of human rights violations based on sexual orientation and Gender and Identity, a motion initiated by South Africa. It is still in the process of ratification. The recent UN Day of Awareness of LGBT rights is a product of this movement. Recent scholars have argued over the importance of the notion of human rights over time. Samuel Moyn's much debated and recent book, The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, argues for a late start and for the fact that the notions of a meaningful role of human rights in international political history is only starting in the 1970s, and it led to the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s. In many ways, Samuel Moyn's thesis fits the CHA story. It's the 1970s, the 1980s, not only for the timing of its explicit engagement with human rights, but also for the prevalence of East-West tensions in that particular case of advocacy. Much of the production since then reads like a series, the production of the history of human rights reads like a series of discussion of Moyn, showing that this rights revolution, to use the expression of Canadian human rights intellectual Michael Ignatieff, was not sudden, and that its achievements are precarious. My colleagues on this panel have documented many aspects of this checkered history. In matters of the rights of intimacy and family life, to use again Ignatieff's word, Canada can claim some measure of leadership. In 1969, the criminal law that punished sodomy by up to 14 years in jail was amended by the Liberal government to allow sex between consenting adults of the same sex if they were at least 21 years old. In 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that all human rights legislation in Canada had to protect sexual orientation. And in 1977, 22 years earlier, Quebec was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. In many ways, Canada's distinct legal and political institutions and legacies, which had initially much more to do with discrimination against ethnic and racialized communities, later helped human rights-based claims about gender and sexuality to be heard. Since then, the legalization of marriage and the many public measures to enforce this stance have served as a model in many countries. To appear to be more rapid than elsewhere, these changes are no less problematic. For one, they have rarely come out of a peaceful road towards a more liberal society, as Lyle's paper reminds us. And the struggles needs to be remembered, not only because they still exist, albeit to a lesser extent, but also because they call for vigilance and they call for some humility. And here I would like to mention Helen Jefferson's recent book on Helen Jefferson-Linsky's recent book on sexual diversity and the Sochi 2014 Olympics, which is just out in 2014, and I had brought some little leaflets because we did not invite you because we were not aware of our book when we put the panel together, and I forgot the leaflets in my hotel room. So, for the record, I said it, and my apologies to Helen. Muslim scholars studying human rights in cross-cultural perspectives and recent critics of the anti-Russian biases of Western diplomats insist on the recent nature of some discrepancies to minimize the easy dichotomies between East and West, as Erica's papers has done so well today, and between North and South. New historians of human rights warn similarly of the new form of racial and class exclusions that may happen within queer communities and might be left unattended by the rhetoric of sexuality-based rights. So in conclusion, why Sochi and why this campaign? The CHA's capacity for advocacy is not only dependent on its principles, but also on its resources in time and energy. The decision to write the letter to President Putin came after careful discussion within the executive on the mandate and the energies of the association. Examples of inhibitions to free expression were many, such as the Russian culture minister's public denial of Tchaikovsky's same-sex orientation. But for those outside wishing to be read and find, and for those outside wishing to be read and find documents there, and for that section, I rely a lot on what Lyle and I discussed. As an association aiming to represent all serious students of history in Canada of every field, including Russian history, and committed to the values of non-discrimination, fairness, and equality in the practice of the discipline, the CHA could not accept this situation. In addition, intellectual exchanges with practitioners of the humanities and social sciences within Russia, many of whom LGBT people, had long revealed the existence of a community engaged in the scholarly study of LGBT society and history, and they needed the CHA support and solidarity. History can only thrive as a discipline when everyone is given an equal opportunity to study it, and any form of such discrimination is contrary to Canadian law and the values of the Canadian historical profession. And I will finish by quoting Dominique Marshall, who kindly offered these words to reinforce what I was saying in my paper. Canada has a long history of promoting human rights abroad, and to do so using our own legal system as a framework that other countries can adopt. It was one of the first nations in the world to link, to a degree, human rights to their politics and their policies of foreign aid. We have one of the oldest human rights institutions in the world. Organizations like the CHA can play a constructive role in informing countries around the world and places like Russia about its human rights system. We have experience creating a successful system that protects gays and lesbians, albeit imperfectly. Perhaps if we could promote our legal system in Russia, it might prevent such abuses in the future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup aux 4 conférenciers. Maintenant, c'est le temps de la discussion et des questions. Nous avons quand même encore 20-25 minutes pour ce faire. Please identify yourself and tell to whom your comment is addressed or question. Qui veut être le premier ou la première?
I had a question for Erica because I know only a little bit of, Dominique University of Alberta. I know a little bit about Russian history, and Russia is one of the rare countries today that has no national human rights institution, so it's somewhat unique in that regard. The question is it seems to me you're suggesting there's a continuity between aspects of the Stalinist regime and the type of attitudes towards human rights we see today in Putin. Do you ever get a sense there's a kind of Russian rights culture, perhaps? Is there a particular philosophy of human rights that pervades Russian history that may help us either understand what's going on now or as a break with that, the Soviet past, or as a continuation of it? I'm just thinking of the Soviet Constitution, for instance, was very different from the American ones in terms of recognizing economic and social rights and emphasizing duties to the state rather than the Western model, which is the state's role in protecting the individual. And so I'm trying to get my head around, is there any kind of Russian rights culture that might help us understand what Putin's doing either as a break from the past or continuity?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit of both. I don't know exactly the human rights sort of history there, but I mean, throughout the 20th century, the Soviet project, the Soviet Union saw itself just as the West as the inheritors of Enlightenment culture, and they were just doing it a different way. I mean, Marxism coming out of the quintessential sort of Western answers to sort of liberalism and equality, and so they really saw themselves as not, and Stalin's another era, but they didn't necessarily see themselves as a repressive, boot-stomping society, even though that's sort of hard for us to wrap our heads around. They saw themselves, like I say, what I think Putin is still doing, as sort of an alternate modernity, just as real as sort of the Western model. The Stalinist era obviously is horrific for human rights abuses, for the Gulag, for the terror, and historians are still working through how to deal with all of that. There's a new historiography about a perpetrator culture that we see in sort of Nazi German historiography for this. But after Stalin, there's a new commitment to rule of law and legality and obeying rule of law. And there's the Khrushchev era, there's really a sense of, we recognize publicly that Stalin did this wrong, that he was an aberration in Soviet history. So even in the late 40s, the 50s, and 60s, excuse me, not the late 40s, after Stalin dies in 53, the 50s into the 60s, there's a sense of disowning Stalin, right? That's not real Russian history and values. That's not Sovietness. And we are now committed. This is why Khrushchev releases so many prisoners, for instance, from the Gulag. This was illegal. We're for rule of law. So it doesn't quite get to your question, but there's been moments where, you know, it's again not just a continuity of lack of human rights, I don't think. But at the same time, whenever I sort of say things like that, I feel like I'm apologizing for the Soviet Union a little bit. There's horrific human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. There's no freedoms for LGBT people even after 1945. So, I think it's continuity and a break in what Putin's doing. I think he's reaffirming or persecuting things that have not been illegal since 1991. Yeltsin decriminalized homosexuality in the early 90s. There was a different path going on, and Putin has made a decision to re-engage with this and make it illegal again when he didn't have to. It's not just he's continuing some older thing. I think he's really deciding to do it anew, and I'm still grappling myself with why, and historians political scientists are doing great work on this, and the historians are like, what do we do with this? So it's complicated, I guess. Hi, by the way, I think I knew you back in the day, and you recognized the name.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Autre question, commentaire? Nicole?
Michael, I was intrigued by this, I forget the expression, the gender verification, the
gender verification test.
What gives right? Is there any drum roll preparation for this to happen, or what sparked this all of a sudden interest in testing?
There's something of a panic amongst Western sports officials in the mid to late 80s about mannish-looking Eastern European female Olympic competitors in the throwing events, in the field events, and the two female athletes that get the most attention for this are the Press sisters. And so there's all sorts of rumors going around about, are they men? Are they being doped to become more like men? What's going on? And so the International Track and Field Federation, the IOC, starts to bring in gender verification tests, primarily, I think, to sort of go after those suspicious Eastern European athletes. The Press sisters retire just before the tests become very widespread, and it would be very difficult to evade that kind of testing. The tests themselves change over time as well. They start off being a physical examination where a medical doctor, where the female athlete goes into a room with the medical doctor who gets to look and see and decide yes or no. And then it changes to, and anyone affiliated with the University of Western Ontario can take a bow or run and hide. The bar body tests, sort of a chromatin test where they take a swab just inside the cheek, and then they would look for XX or XY, right? But again, it's down to this sort of binary understanding of how sexuality works. So it starts off basically as a medical exam, and then it turns into something more. That's what I should use breakthrough in your famous quotation marks, right? That's the scientific breakthrough, is the bar body test, which comes partly out of UWO.
See? Oui.
Yves Frenette from Simon Fraser University. I'm afraid I can't be as, I'm much more cynical about politics than Mike Dawson is. So, I mean, not that they're commensurate, but, Laura Bush cried about the oppression of the Afghanistan women when George Bush invaded Afghanistan. So, I think there's a more important political play going on, which you drew attention to, but I'm not sure that doesn't give me reason to be optimistic. I wouldn't put it that way. And in fact, I think that maybe we're in danger of being complacent and perhaps even a little bit celebratory about our legacy of progress in Canada. So some of you may know that this summer World Pride is being held in Toronto, which is a huge international human rights conference. 14 Ugandan, and you all know, I don't need to tell you what's going on in Uganda, 14 Ugandan activists and intellectuals proposed papers to give at this conference. All of these 14 were accepted. Everyone had their visa denied by the Canadian government. So, there's a lot of policing still going on. The Refugee Board, when people claim refugee status in Canada on the basis of their sexual orientation, a study that was headed up by a team led by Lydia Namaste at Concordia showed that the Refugee Board was saying if women didn't look like butches and men didn't look effeminate, they said they were lying and rejected their claims. So they're deciding whether or not your claim is authentic based on incredibly outdated ideas about gendered behavior. So there are many, many ways in which our state is perpetuating incredibly homophobic ideas of policing people. And then, of course, we have the case of Trinity Western University. So you're nodding, so I don't need to tell you. So I think we need to be careful. I also wanted to say, and again, this is just a friendly response. I should begin by saying that I'm very, very, very appreciative of the CHA taking this kind of stance on this particular issue. I think it's wonderful. But I don't know if I misunderstood you, Dominique, but I think at the end of your paper you said something about Russia perhaps benefiting from our legal traditions. I don't want to respond to it if I misunderstood you.
Benefiting from it, now that maybe
there's something to offer.
That there are things in our own history that might be interesting for others if we do the history of what's positive about.
Right, and that may be true. Like we know South Africa, for example, was the first constitution that adopted sexual orientation protection, and their constitutional lawyers were Canadian. So they were, just happened to be at that historical moment, people were ready to do that. So on that basis, we've seen how Canadian legal scholars and constitutional lawyers have been able to be really helpful. But none of you mentioned how the lesbian and gay community in Russia responded and what they called upon the international community to do, which was not boycott. And I think that's something we can sometimes overlook, is actually to turn to the people there, the intellectuals, the activists who are there, and say, how can we support you in what you're doing? Because what you're doing makes sense. You know your own context. We have our context, and you've made that point really, really well, right? We're so quick to judge, Russia, right? And that's our framework. But they have their own framework, and they know that their political strategy is best, right? So to look to what they're doing and what they're thinking and the ideas they have, and to assist them in seeing those come forward. So just a few thoughts on the really provocative panel we've had tonight.
We had a discussion about, and Lyle will be able to explain that better, but do we only sign it ourselves, or do we ask people in Russia to, and do we name organizations that we support, or do we ask, to what extent do we involve Russian colleagues, and we decided not to? And maybe Lyle can say why.
Well, we tried to correspond to the degree possible with people we could get in touch with. Some in Russia, LGBT, or scholars of LGBT Russian history, both within Russia and outside of Russia. So there's Alexander Konnikov in St. Petersburg. He's a sociologist. He's written historical papers he's with a research institute there. Mariana Maravieva, who is Russian, but she's now teaching in England. And then Dan Healy is English, and he teaches at Oxford. And Laurie Essig, who teaches in Connecticut at Millbury College. Because we had received some expressions of concern along these lines, whatever we do, we shouldn't be doing any harm, and that was good advice. But I can report that basically the advice we got from Alexander, Mariana, Laurie, and so on is that we should speak out on this. Now, we didn't comment on the boycott, and I agree with you, the boycott is a problematic issue, and you get views on both sides of it. But I think the general advice we got is we should speak out. Silence is the enemy. They want this, and I assured Alexander, for example, well, I said, thank you, but I assure you I won't use your name. No, he wanted me to use his name. So that's why I'm using his name. And so these are heroic people like him, because I think they're really sticking their necks out. But in a sense, we know from our experience in Canada, it takes some people sticking their necks out, because that's how we can break through our biggest enemy, which is silence.
Yeah, just to clarify, I didn't mean my last comment there as a critique or anything, or a reflection on your actions. Just more broadly, we ourselves, as a people, must remember.
No, it's a very good point.
Yeah,
It's a very good point.
Well received. Yeah.
Yes.
Which is a big hockey school for men and women. And we actually have female athletes who are from Canada, the United States, and from all over who play internationally for several different countries. And it's notorious amongst our female hockey players that look at Team Canada, Team USA, and look at who they will Sport Canada and the U.S. sporting agencies, who they identify as the faces of U.S. women's hockey, of Canadian women's hockey. It's always straight women. Always.
Absolutely.
It's like it is so clear that some of my female students are also hockey players. They're outraged by it because it's just like, well, unless you can or pass. I mean, we have not, just really stressing your point as well, that we have not come all that far. It's easy to wave a flag at certain moments when it seems cool. And we put down brushes or whoever is our other enemy, but we still have such an incredible distance to go just in terms of the things, because they're not overtly discriminating against, or don't seem to be discriminating against the lesbians on the hockey. I know hockey best, but it also happens. We know it's soccer as well. And literally, this just keeps going on. And if we don't say something, we perpetuate it here as well. I mean, I know we're not quite as drastic as the Russians, but it is the case, and it's really hurtful to these young women who are representing. In this case, I just know people from 4 different countries who played on the national teams, and or in some cases would like to be thought of as more of a representative of their team and their nation. They don't get the same shot, and so it's just very, very much out there, and it is a real problem.
Thank you. One last question. Anna.
Julia Corey, I'm not an academic, I'm a member of the public, but I'm just curious, maybe to everybody who is a professional historian here in the room, how much of a relationship is there between when a country is suffering economic problems and it has a kind of strong dictatorship, if you like, where the whole LGBTQ issue becomes a diversion from the troubles that the nation are experiencing. So it's sort of take people's mind. It's not exactly bread and circuses, but it's sort of a complete, let's look at something completely different and find a scapegoat rather than deal with the real problem. I'm just curious.
Qui voudrait répondre?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a sort of populist politics move by Putin. I'm not a political scientist, and they're sort of working on exactly what his electoral strategies are and doing this and this sort of thing. But he's certainly playing to votes, especially in more conservative areas of the country outside the capitals, and it does seem to certainly be, if not a diversion from real issues, sort of he's making it a real issue, he's sort of playing it up, but he's also, the sentiment is there in a lot of communities, and he's sort of drawing it out in a way in this legislation. But it's certainly, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a certain moment when it's sort of fostering nationalist sentiment and trying to make Russia out to be a certain kind of place and playing up these prejudices in the meantime. So it is a distraction from the economic issues and dissent. He faced a lot of dissent in December 2011, the elections. And so he's really trying to shore up support anywhere he can. And he's finding it, as I say, outside the major cities and in
more conservative religious communities, and this issue plays very well in that sense.
Donc, merci beaucoup aux 4 conférenciers. It was a very enlightened evening. Merci.
You've been listening to a recording of a roundtable discussion, Sochi and Beyond, Russia's anti-gay legislation, human rights, and the practice of history. The roundtable was held on Sunday, May 25th, 2014, as part of the Canadian Historical Association annual meeting held at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca.